So let's talk about clothing for alpine climbing. Hello and welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, my name's Dave Searle and I'm an IFMGA guide based out here in Chamonix. So in this video we're going to talk about the clothing systems that I use when I'm alpine climbing in the European Alps in the summer. So if you're not familiar with the European Alps, we have plenty of 4,000 metre peaks, 82 to be precise, and we have a lot of climbing that's on 3,000 and even 2,000 metre peaks as well. The temperatures out in the Alps can range from anything from the mid to high 30s in the valley all the way down to the minus figures when you're up on the high summits of Mont Blanc and Monte Rosa, for example. So having a clothing system that can accommodate those big swings in temperature is really important. Not wearing the right clothing could mean that you lead to sweating too much, and that could either leave you really cold when the temperature drops, or you're going to be risking dehydration, because alpine climbing generally, a lot of the time, you're quite dehydrated. So we need our clothing to serve multiple purposes. Yes, we need the protection from the elements like wind, snow, rain, cold, etc. But also we need protection from the sun. And we also need our clothes to be really good at managing sweat and moisture so that we don't stay too wet for too long in case the temperature drops because the cloud comes over or something like that. So I like to approach my clothing as a layering system. Now the layering system that I use on my top half might not necessarily be mirrored on the bottom half, so we're going to talk about some of the subtle differences there. But what I'm looking for is that I can layer my clothing on top of itself as it gets colder or as the conditions deteriorate with bad weather, for example. And what I mean by that is I'm generally trying to avoid having to take off layers that are further down in my system to then put things back on again. But let's start with that closest to the skin layer, which is often referred to as a base layer, and let's talk about some of the things that I use and some of the considerations that I'm thinking about when I'm operating in the Alps in summer. So there's three main types of material that you can have as a base layer or a next to skin layer when you're alpine climbing. Those can be categorized into wool and synthetic and mixed fibers, so it's a mix of synthetic and wool. Now the pros with wool is it's really good odour management, so if you're doing a big trip of alpine climbing where you're travelling around in a van, staying in a campsite, it could be a nice thing having wool base layers, because yeah, you do get kind of stinky when you're doing lots of alpine climbing, so merino wool can be really good for that. The downside with wool though is it can retain just a little bit more moisture than synthetic base layers, which means that you can feel a little bit colder and clammier if you've been working hard on an approach, for example. Generally, I'm using merino wool more often when I'm trying to stay warm. So if I'm higher up in the mountains, for example, up on the glaciers or really up high on the high plateaus of Monte Rosa and Mont Blanc, that's when I'd be wanting to have a merino wool base layer. I find it a little bit warmer and I'm hopefully not going to be sweating as much whilst I'm up there. So synthetic, on the other hand, the pros of that are it dries really quickly, so if you are on an extended climbing trip you might be able to wash your base layers every evening and they would dry before the next day. I've certainly done that before when I've been doing trips. Synthetic base layers can feel a little bit cooler when you're operating in really warm temperatures, and they're really good at moving sweat away from you and keeping you drier for a little bit longer. Yes, the downsides with synthetic base layers is they can get really stinky. Mixed base layers, which are a mix between synthetic and merino, can be a good compromise to that, but generally I'm defaulting to synthetic base layers during the summer, and what I'm trying to find is one that has a good hood on it as well that I can fit over the top of my helmet. Now if it's particularly warm and I'm approaching a hut, for example, I might be wearing a base layer t-shirt and I might just be covering myself in sunscreen for that approach. A t-shirt's going to be a little bit cooler than having a long sleeve with a hood on it for sure, but the nice thing with having long sleeves and a hood, especially when you're operating on a glacier, is you can really have good protection from the sun. I often use a baseball cap and some big sunglasses with nose protection, and that means that I only really have my face out, which I could cover with a buff even as well, and that way the sun isn't really going to get to me at all. And if it does, or if I just need my face out because I don't want to wear that buff because it's too warm, then I can just cover my face in some sunscreen. But long sleeves are a really good idea on the glacier anyway. If you're roped up to people and you're walking across the glacier, there is a risk that you could fall in a crevasse, or your friend falls in a crevasse and you're getting dragged across the surface of the snow. And snow can be super abrasive, and having long sleeves could really protect you from any kind of skin injuries in that context. So long sleeves are a really good idea on the glacier, protection from both the sun and also, like I say, falling in crevasses. By the way, I'm going to leave a link to all the clothing that I'm talking about in this video down in the description, so you can go and check that out as well. And before we carry on with this video, I wanted to just remind you and talk a little bit more about the Oak app that I've been working on a little bit this summer. Now, what is Oak? Simply put, it's a platform that you can use to try and find partners and other people heading out and doing adventures. You can also post your own tours and see if other people want to join you. It's just a really neat way to get connected with people for doing mountain sports. We've just added a whole load of extra sports onto the app, so now there's trail running, hiking, mountain biking. We've got alpine climbing, mountaineering, via ferrata. So definitely go and check out that app and see what's going on. The community's growing every day. It's a really cool place. There's loads of people that are doing stuff together. There's social events, and sometimes we're offering even guided trips with me, for example. There's also other courses that are popping up as well. So if you're on the market for doing some guided trips, then you might be able to find that on the app as well. Again, I'm going to leave a link down in the description for the Oak app, so please go and check it out, download it, and let me know what you think. Okay, so back to alpine climbing clothing. So we've thought about the base layer that we're wearing on the top half, and what I would say is I very rarely wear base layers on my lower half. In the summer, I just find it too warm, and what I'm normally doing is using a 2-layer system. So I have a soft shell pant, and then I have a set of hard shells in my bag if I think that I might need them. Now, that's a really key point about alpine climbing, is we're always trying to reduce the weight on our bags as much as possible, and there's quite often times that I'm not even carrying a waterproof jacket. If I know the activity that I'm doing is going to finish relatively early, and I know that the weather forecast is really stable, then I don't really need to be carrying a waterproof jacket around. Now, that can sound really bold if you're used to carrying waterproofs around because you've been operating in the UK, for example, but it simply is true. There's a lot of people that don't carry waterproofs all the time in the mountains. However, if I was heading somewhere high up on the glaciers, so let's say I was doing Mont Blanc, for example, I would definitely have a Gore-Tex over trouser, and what I'd be looking for is something that has a full-length zip on the side of it. That's really important because you might have crampons on and you don't really want to have to take your boots and crampons off to be able to put extra protection on over the top. So having a full-length leg zip can be a really good idea, because that means that you can just get that on over the top of your boots and crampons, even put it over the top of your harness, or maybe you can stuff the legs of the waterproof pants down through your harness and then you can zip them on underneath your harness. Occasionally I'll wear a pair of shorts on the approach to a hut, especially if it's really warm. But generally I'm going to be wearing a super thin, light, soft shell pant like these, which are the Ascender light pants. They've got a little bit of crampon protection. They've got a pocket on the side of the leg for my phone, which is great because it keeps it out of the way of my harness. And they've got an elasticated waistband, which is really nice because then you don't have to have a belt on underneath your harness as well. Earlier in the summer, when things are a little bit snowier, for example, or later in the summer when things are cooling off again, I might wear a thicker soft shell pant. But with those thicker soft shell pants, I'm probably looking for something that has a vented leg zip on the side, which just means that I can dump a little bit of extra heat if I need to. Those pants might also have an internal gaiter, and if you have a gaiter on your boot, that can be a really good system to avoid having to use actual dedicated gaiters. But having a gaiter can be a really nice idea. Having short gaiters is quite nice as well. They're nice and light, but a lot of the time I try and leave those behind as much as I can. So let's talk about the next layer that I'm going to be putting over my base layer top half, and that's going to be a thin soft shell like this. So this is the Borealis jacket from Rab, and this has been a really favourite piece of mine over the last few years. It's not particularly windproof and it's not particularly waterproof. It's actually a very thin, light, stretchy material, but it offers really good protection when you're chimneying up some granite chimney, for example. And also it's got a nice thin light hood that you can stretch over your climbing helmet. I would say this gives me enough protection for most of the days of alpine climbing that I'm doing, and it's just a really nice light thin jacket that's super breathable. It just keeps me really comfortable most of the day. Having a couple of chest pockets like this is really good. You can have sunscreen in there and snacks in the other one, for example, and that means you don't have to worry about having some pockets on the hip belt of your bag, for example, because you can have things accessible right here. If temperatures were a little bit cooler, I might consider putting a thin fleece that goes underneath this. For somewhere like Mont Blanc though, I probably wouldn't bother with this jacket because it's not really offering me protection from the elements. I'd probably swap this layer out for a thin fleece. However, I do really like synthetic jackets like this. This is the Zenair Alpine Light jacket. I use this all the time. I use it for a whole bunch of different things, and it's just a really neat layer that can just go over the top of this thin soft shell just to give me a little bit of extra warmth like that. If I then needed more protection, I'd then have a waterproof jacket that could go over the top of it. The key points with this system though is everything is nice and light. So the base layer is nice and light, the soft shell is nice and light, the insulated jacket is nice and light, and this Gore-Tex is pack light, so again it packs really small in my bag and it keeps the weight down. However, if I was operating on the high summits of Mont Blanc and Monte Rosa, this probably wouldn't be enough. I'd probably also want a thin down jacket that I could put over the top as well. Now, one of the problems with alpine climbing clothing systems is you'll probably get it wrong at some point, so I'd really encourage you to go out there and experiment, but also take with you the mentality of you're probably going to be uncomfortable at some point. Alpine climbing is as much about suffering that uncomfort as it is about actually achieving those goals. Sometimes it's just not appropriate to change your clothing whilst you're in the middle of a pitch and you're getting too hot, for example. So you need to kind of just deal with it until you get to a better point that you can change your clothing. Being too hot and being too cold is just really commonplace when you're out doing stuff in the mountain. Ideally though, if you do get too hot, you're not going to lose too much moisture through sweat, and you're going to have layering systems that are going to be able to deal with that moisture so you can dry off as quickly as possible. Anyway, we'll leave it there for now. Hopefully you found that video interesting and useful. If you did, then give us a thumbs up. If you've got any thoughts, questions or comments, then please go down there and leave me a comment in the comment section. But if you're going to do one thing and one thing only that's going to help me and my channel out, and it's completely free, it's go down there and hit that subscribe button. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.